Hi, I'm Stewart Spinks and welcome to episode 306 of my podcast, Beekeeping Short and Sweet. It still doesn't feel like we've really got started with our beekeeping season, yet in the next couple of weeks, borage will start flowering and the summer nectar flow will be in full swing. Time for more preparations, and I also turn my attention towards cut comb honey production. Beekeeping Short and Sweet, a beekeeping podcast for the inquisitive beekeeper with a short attention span. A beekeeper, in fact, just like me. This week's podcast is sponsored in part by Modern Beekeeping, suppliers of general beekeeping equipment including high-density polyhives. These include Paradise National hives, Swenty polyhives and of course Honeypaw hives, my particular favourite. More than this, Modern Beekeeping also supply traditional cedar and pine hives, a range of very effective bee feeds called Apimix and Apipasta, and a full range of all the must-have beekeeping equipment for every beekeeper. For all your beekeeping needs, contact Paul at Modern Beekeeping by visiting their website www.modernbeekeeping.co.uk. Welcome back to the podcast, everyone, and at last a little warmer weather for, I guess, most of us to enjoy. It's still raining, of course, and the warmer sunshine has been such a long time coming. Many beekeepers that I've talked to have had such a difficult spring and early summer. It looks like we'll have a few more days of showery weather, but crucially, the daytime and overnight temperatures look set to rise, and that bodes well for the nectar flow, which here in Norfolk at least appears to be well underway. Brambles are in full flower, with lots more flower buds developing, and trees such as limes are obviously budding up and getting ready to flower too. For the most part, I think our bees have coped pretty well. I think that more generally it's us beekeepers that struggle with the weather, certainly more than our bees. However, that said, there have been many reports of colonies starving this spring, or at least colonies on the verge of starving, and warnings have been flying around, sent out from all sorts of different sources, both official, in the case of the National Bee Unit here in the UK, and not so official on social media by the likes of ourselves, along with lots of other beekeepers on those various social media feeds. I'm glad to say that, through possibly more luck than judgment, the vast majority of our colonies have plenty of food on them, and I've not had to worry about issues of food reserves in brood nest areas. The reason for this is because of mainly non-beekeeping work that we've been carrying out at the unit. Basically, the creation of this new office that I'm sat in and all the faffing around that I normally get up to trying to get things organised. The upshot of this, coupled with the ridiculously cold and wet weather that we've had to endure, has meant that we still haven't yet taken any spring honey off our colonies, and thank goodness for it. Large colonies building rapidly in the spring and going on to develop in early summer will consume a huge amount of food, and in normal spring and early summer weather conditions, if there are such conditions these days, although it gets cold and wet occasionally, there's usually a warmer spell of weather where the bees can get out and forage, storing away honey and pollen in the brood nest area to save for later. If they're not able to do this, colonies will rapidly head downhill, with starvation a very real risk in a very short space of time. Here I would talk about my fairly regular reminder I throw out to all beekeepers to always have a reason for looking in a hive, and one of those reasons should be asked every time you open the hive, and that is, will these bees have enough food to last them until I inspect them again? If the answer is a resounding yes, then you have no real reason to worry. But if you're thinking, maybe, possibly, they might be okay, then I would think you ought to pop some fondant or syrup on them. And what if you're unable, because of the weather, to inspect your bees for 2 or even 3 weeks in the late spring? That could simply be disastrous for you and your bees. It was brought home to me just last week, actually, and we had a lucky escape. You'll know that we've been introducing new queens into some of our colonies, and just a few days after we popped the cages into the split hives, we went back to make sure the queens had been released and all was well. All of the queens are doing fantastically well, and for the most part, maybe 20 out of 25 split colonies were all provisioned well and have enough food for several weeks. But I'd obviously made a miscalculation with the others. They were all on the verge of starving, with one colony in particular on the verge of collapse. Now these are all nucleus-sized splits, maybe 3 or 4 seams of bees, but in the colder weather they're going to eat their way through an awful lot of food, and I hadn't allowed enough frames of food in these nukes. I was just relieved that I'd caught them in time. Another day or two and it would have been too late. Emergency feeding is exactly what it sounds like, and you need to do whatever you can to get some easy-to-use stores into these colonies as quickly as you can. The problem splits were all at our fishing lakes apiary, and as luck would have it, it's where I store our spare syrup feed. The first thing to do is to get the bees feeding on a little food immediately, and that means dribbling a little syrup directly onto them. Starving bees move very, very slowly, if at all. It's like they're super cold and can hardly move, so it's no good adding a frame of solid oilseed rape food stores and putting it at the edge of the brood box. The bees need to be straight on it. You'll also notice the bees will usually be in a cluster searching for food, and it's easy to dribble just a tiny amount of syrup, and I mean just a little, directly onto them. As soon as the syrup hit them, I could see bees next to the ones with the syrup on starting to feed and clean those bees, and as soon as they have a little food inside them, they become active really very quickly. The next thing I do is remove a frame from the central area and dribble a little more syrup onto the empty cells. It runs into the cells, but remember, not too much because it will run straight out once you replace the frame, and that could encourage robbing as the syrup drips down from the frame onto the floor and straight through the open mesh bottom. This syrup is to encourage more bees to feed immediately. It's not for storage, it's for immediate energy for all of the colony. The next thing to do is to find some way of giving them food to last them the week until your next inspection and beyond. Now this could be a frame of stores from another colony that's over-provisioned with food. Just remember not to rob a colony so much that you put them in danger. Oh, and remember, they must be a healthy colony. Don't go spreading disease from one colony to another in the act of trying to help them survive. I'm lucky with the Technoset hives that we use, as they have an integrated feeder, so it was a simple task to add some syrup to that feeder. We only have heavy syrup, and that's perfect for our bees really. It's the Apimix syrup from Paul at Modern Beekeeping. I do think, and I know I'm tempting it here, but I do think we're heading into some warmer weather conditions, and the bees will be able to get out and forage this week and beyond. So hopefully the danger has passed. I hope that you've been able to keep your bees safe and well during this very difficult part of the year. All of our full-size colonies have been fine. The delay in taking the spring crop has given them stores aplenty, and while I may not get as big a crop of oilseed rape and spring honey this year, I'm grateful that my bees have had the food they need to continue to develop, ready for that summer nectar flow. I mentioned the queens in the split colonies and how successful the introductions have been so far. The reason for this is the years of getting it wrong, to be honest, and not working out quickly enough just what I've been doing wrong. It seems I'm not alone with this, judging by the emails and messages I get almost on a daily basis currently about this very problem. The overwhelming error seems to be that beekeepers are buying queens and putting them into colonies that they think are queenless, when in actual fact the colony is queen right and has a virgin queen or a new laying queen, and they've failed to spot eggs. It's that age-old problem of being patient with your bees when the season is running away from us and we're all desperate to get a laying queen, filling up cells with eggs in order to have a large foraging population for the summer and the honey crop that we all hope will follow. If you're still waiting for a queen to lay eggs after 4 or 5 weeks, well, maybe in that instance it's time to call it a day. Cull the virgin or non-laying queen in favour of introducing a known, well-mated queen. Right now, eggs being laid will emerge as adult workers sometime in July, so the brood you have, or that you don't have right now, is the foraging force you have for the early to mid-summer period. My plan has very much been to get new queens into splits in early June, so they have time to build a large brood nest area by the end of the month, and thus have a foraging force for the borage and brambles. Of course, the weather has tripped us up a little, and the delay in getting queens into these splits means I don't think we'll have as large a foraging force as I'd hoped for, which inevitably means a reduced honey crop. It's always sensible to adjust your expectations. Don't demand too much of your bees. Try to think logically about what the condition and size of your colony is at, and maybe think pessimistically. Then, if you get more than you thought, you'll be delighted. I have another batch of queens arriving this coming week. What can I expect from them? Well, it will be the middle of June by the time the queen gets herself out of the cage, and another few days will have passed. So, realistically, we can't expect any eggs until literally Midsummer's Day. If I were to expect these splits to deliver a summer honey crop by the end of July, I'd be very disappointed. It just won't happen for me locally, because at the end of July, the nectar tap here, for me, gets turned off very, very quickly. If you're looking forward to a honey crop this summer, my advice would be to pause and think about where your colonies are currently and what realistically you can expect from them. A couple of days ago I travelled to our Borage crop farm to have a final look at how it's progressing and finalise the various locations for hive placement. It's actually looking very healthy, and that increases the anticipation of a decent honey crop for this summer. As with every phase of our beekeeping season, preparation is the key. Some might say preparation in beekeeping is the key to prevention of the next disaster, but let's stay optimistic in our approach. We have a great working relationship with our farmers and landowners, and as with most things, communication is key to getting everything set up for a trouble-free summer. The next 4 to 6 weeks will determine to a greater extent just what our season's honey crop will be. Something that I'm very keen to prepare for our trip to the Borage are our supers and frames for cut comb honey. I've also a box of Ross round frames. All of these represent a huge increase in value of the final honey product that we produce. And if you're wondering how on earth you're going to make any money out of your beekeeping, I thoroughly recommend giving it a try. Personally, I'm not a great fan of the Ross rounds, as last year the bees really struggled to draw them out as well as I thought they would, and the vast majority were not really up to the perfect standard that I would want to see as a premium product, so we didn't attempt to sell them. That said, it was our first attempt, and we were trying to get the bees to fill them with heather honey, so maybe I was pushing the bees a little too hard. This year, we're going to try them on the borage first. If there's a likely crop that the bees can use to fill these Ross round containers totally, it's got to be the borage. Now then, cut comb is very much on the menu. For me, it's a high value, relatively easy to produce honey product. It sells well, looks great, and leaves little waste to clear up after the processing. The key, as with pretty much everything in beekeeping, is preparation. We bimbled along trying to find different configurations of frames and containers until eventually I found a container that I really liked, and then we set ourselves up to fill those containers with cut comb, rather than producing the cut comb and then trying to fit it into whatever containers were available. And to be honest, I really don't like some of the containers that are currently available. We use food-grade clear boxes that show off the beauty of the cut comb in all its glory. That means, of course, there's nowhere to hide a rubbish section of cut comb. Every piece can be seen top and bottom. Every cell is visible, well, almost every cell. Those beneath the thin label strip can't be seen, but it's pretty obvious if you're trying to put a substandard, uncapped piece of comb into one of these boxes. And that's just how I want it. This is a premium product, and our customers have every right to expect it to be as near perfect as possible. Don't try to shortchange your customers with grotty comb. It will only come back to haunt you. Frames for cut comb production are pretty easy to set up. We have thin, super cut comb foundation. This doesn't have wires in it for support, so a little care needs to be taken in securing it to the frame. We've tried various options over the years, and as usual in beekeeping, the simplest methods are very often the best. If you're making up a batch of frames specifically for cut comb, nail them together as usual, but don't remove the top bar wedge. That strip of wood you normally remove to fix the foundation wires beneath. Leave it in place. Next, you need some molten beeswax. If you haven't yet extracted any honey and therefore don't have any cappings to use, simply sacrifice a couple of sheets of foundation with wires in them and pull the wires out. Use a bain-marie to melt the wax, and ideally an old largish metal spoon that you can bend the bowl a little. That is, unless you want to go out and buy a small metal ladle, of course. With the frame upside down, slip the wax foundation into the slot of the top bar and gently dribble some molten wax along the length of the slot and allow this to harden. This will fix the sheet in place nicely, and when you have lots of workers hanging on it, drawing out comb, it won't pull away with the weight of those bees. An alternative method is to use standard foundation as a starter strip along the same groove. Use the same process of fixing it in place, and remember to cut the comb beneath that thicker strip when you're preparing the sections for sale. Again, there are lots of ways of producing cut comb sections. Try out a few and see which one works best for you. Finally today, I wanted to take the opportunity to wish all the dads out there a very happy Father's Day. Here in the UK, today is Father's Day, but regardless of where in the world you're listening, have a very happy Father's Day. Well, that's it for this week. Don't forget to check out my website, www.norfolk-honey.co.uk, and for my latest videos and podcasts with more updates, tips and techniques, it's the same Patreon page, www.patreon.com/Norfolk Honey. And remember, I'm Stewart Spinks, and that was Beekeeping Short and Sweet.